So give me a little introduction of yourself, please.
Hi, my name is Victoria Wu. I study psychology and chemistry at Wellesley College, and I was born in Montreal, Canada, but I grew up in Andover, Massachusetts.
Hello, my name is Van, like the car or the shoe, or Run as in Fun and Run, nothing you don't know. I am a biology, public health, and education studying student, double in public health and bio, minor in education, but I've taken a lot of courses and have additional background in psychology and nutrition. I am born and raised in San Jose, but I go to school in Berkeley, which is about an hour north from here.
Hi, I'm Brandon Wong. I'm a senior at UConn, and I'm Chinese and Vietnamese.
My name is Andrew, and I live in a city called Guelph in Ontario. It's just an hour away from Toronto, in Canada. I've been involved with VSA since my freshman year, and then I've been involved with my region following graduation. I majored in biology and psychology, and I also did a master's in global health. In terms of my interests in everything, I do value friendships as well as doing a lot of nature-y things, as well as doing a lot of artwork and media work.
Right, so this is my friend, Austin. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. Okay. He goes to the University of New South Wales and studies finance and statistics. He was born in China, in Fuzhou.
That's wrong.
Sorry. You said it. Where is it?
I was born in New Zealand.
Oh, sorry. He was born in New Zealand. That's it.
Yeah.
Alright.
Moved to Australia when I was 2. Yeah. This bloke here, his name is Marshall Lee. He's also Australian, but of Chinese heritage. He was born in Shanghai, moved to Australia when he was 3.
That's the next question.
Just keep going.
And then he also goes to the University of New South Wales, and he's a super senior. He's studying economics and psychology.
Yeah, thank you. That's it. That's pretty good. Good. Alright.
When did your family immigrate to the United States, and where did they immigrate from?
So both my parents are from China. My mom is from Nanjing, and my dad is from Wuhan. And they met in graduate school, and then I actually have an older brother, and after they had him, they immigrated. This was around like the 90s. They immigrated to the United States, specifically New York.
So originally, my dad, his family was living in Vietnam, but my grandpa was actually someone who worked for radio interpreting for the Vietnam army, for the Southern Vietnam Army, and so he was actually in Singapore during the time of the fall of Saigon. And so with his connections, we somehow have family in France. So after a series of really long, complicated phone calls to verify my grandpa's identity and his relationship to his family in France, which was a long time ago, then he was able to connect with a family member who was able to sponsor my grandpa and then my dad to France. My dad lost a brother along the way, and so in the mid 75, in 75, my dad was able to go to France alongside his mom, his dad, and then his brother and his sister. From there, my dad's older brother, who was the smartest of the family, was able to file for paperwork to be a refugee in the United States. And that had happened in the late 70s. It took a long time to sponsor my dad from France to the United States, because my dad has a brother relationship with his brother, obviously. For you to sponsor parents at that time, it was much easier. And so my dad's older brother sponsored his parents. So my dad was the only one living in France for 9 years until he was awarded sponsorship. And then in the 90s, when he met my mom, that was when they were talking for a couple of years, and then he sponsored her or married her in Vietnam, and then sponsored her to the United States, and that took about a year. And so my mom came to the United States in '94. That's my parents' immigration story.
Very
So my mom is an immigrant, and my dad's a refugee.
Okay, very nice.
My family immigrated to the United States from the midst of the Vietnam War, at the closing time, I guess we would call it. They were at a concentration camp, and my grandpa was an intelligence officer, and he found a way to sponsor his whole family. They escaped on jump boats.
Austin, when did your parents move to Australia?
We moved to so actually what happened was my parents they were living in China. They actually came to America for a bit on a work placement.
That's really
And
interesting.
they actually left China like in I think 1994 for New Zealand.
Okay.
And then we stayed there for 6 years, or they had me and my sister in New Zealand, and then they.
So you have a sister as well?
Yeah, I have a sister. Yeah. And so then we moved to Australia in 1998, but they left China in like 1994. Yeah. Sorry, not 1998. I was born 1998.
Yeah.
That's they moved to Australia in 2000.
Okay. That was
New
pretty-
millennium.
That was pretty good.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's it.
Oh, no, there's also me though.
Oh, yeah. So I think his parents, they moved to Australia when he was 3 years old.
Exactly.
From Shanghai.
That is correct.
Yeah, and then
That's it. That's weird.
Was that wait, what was the question?
Why do they immigrate to the U.S. and how do they do it?
So it was mostly for financial reasons, you know. My mom came to finish, my mom came for PhD, but my dad came here for work. They just really wanted to like have a better life than what they could have in China, and they also wanted to have me. So
for my dad, it was the war. They had wealth when they were in Vietnam, but then of course following '75, then they lost all of that, especially on my dad's side. So he had been better off because his family did own a business at the time when they lost their wealth and were afraid of persecution and losing more wealth, losing their lives. And they moved to France, or were refugees in France. And then for my mom, it was because she married my dad. She had no intention or no capacity and no other way of moving to the United States. So she thought that she would actually end up living in Vietnam for the rest of her life. But that wasn't the case because she had met my dad.
They immigrated because Vietnam was in a position of chaos, and everyone who is Southern Vietnamese or Chinese had their businesses taken away and given away towards this communist government.
So I'm a Vietnamese Canadian, so my parents, they immigrated to Canada. Actually, they were sponsored by a family in Guelph, so they went kind of in the midst of war, so they took refuge in neighboring countries around Vietnam, and then after that they were sponsored by this family, so they flew to Guelph, and that's where they've resided ever since. So they immigrated from Vietnam, specifically southern Vietnam.
I'm not sure about Austin's parents, but I'll start with my parents first. So, my parents immigrated to Australia because there's more opportunities in Australia compared to China at the time. And yeah, they also came over to actually do like an intensive English course. And my father really enjoyed his time here, so he stayed in Australia. For Austin, yeah, why did your parents move to Australia, Austin?
Yeah, so my parents moved to Australia for like similar reasons. So it was for better opportunities, because back in the day, you know, it was just seen like Western culture was just seen as a lot better than China.
Yeah, that's true.
And then so then they did it for more opportunities for themselves as well as more opportunity for us as children. And yeah, I think that's mostly the reason why. I think also they just kind of wanted to get away, or like be like independent. I think, and move away like outside China, or whatever. Yeah, just do something different.
So I think the key takeaway is that there was just more opportunities in Australia compared to China at the time.
Yeah, I think Australia was also very Chinese friendly because like everyone was moving to Australia at the time.
Also, the immigration laws back then wasn't that as strict.
Yeah, it was like pretty easy to move in.
Yeah.
And it was just like, I think it was just for a better life, pretty much. Yeah, they always like tell me about like what they didn't get as kids and stuff, and that we're so privileged to get these things. So they always tell me about.
Can you give us an example of what?
Alright, so an example would be sometimes they would just, when I'm not eating my food, I don't feel like eating my food.
Yeah.
They're like, you should eat that food, because when we were children, we were fighting for food, and we used to just eat rice, and that's it.
That's a very good example.
Rice is pretty expensive.
Just another example, I guess, was back in the day, like instead of using like vegetable oil and stuff, they would use like pig oil, because like they would like get the leftover oil from cooking meat,
Right.
and they would reuse that just because like, you know, it was like real poor and stuff back then.
So what is the point that you're making?
That was just another example of why they wanted to move to Australia.
Oh, the opportunities to use
Yeah,
other alternative brands of oil.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's it.
What was it like growing up as a first-generation Asian American, both within your own family and in your surrounding community?
I would definitely say I wasn't really aware of it that much when I was first growing up, because most of my interactions were like in my family or in preschools, you know, and I never really felt like, I don't think I was like mature enough to conceive that we were like a first generation family. And this is when my family actually moved to Canada, and that's where I was born. But then when I was around 5, we moved to America, and I think in combination with just like moving places, you know, it became really like apparent to me that I was different from people. And this is like also when I started, you know, grade school. And I don't know, I guess I don't want to sound negative, but the first time I realized that I was different was actually, you know, like in 3rd grade when people ask you questions like, oh, like, do you eat dog? Or like even like Canadian jokes like, oh, like, are you a socialist? And I was just like, what are you talking about? You know? Yeah.
3rd graders knew what socialism is?
Yeah, I was like, your parents are telling you to be racist to me. Like, I know.
So growing up, I had, like right across the street from my house, we had a Vietnamese plaza. Go down a couple of blocks on my left after making a left turn from my neighborhood, then I'll get to another Vietnamese plaza. If I had made a right turn instead, go maybe 2, 3, not even 3 miles to get to another plaza. So Vietnamese plaza is literally everywhere. It was super normal for me. We had access to all the different kinds of Asian foods growing up. I think I had only realized, or in retrospect, I only realized that I had some sense of shame about that, and I had some acknowledgement or awareness of the kinds of systems that I grew up in, because in sophomore year of high school, there was an assignment that asked us to go to a grocery store and then find all of the different aisles, or label all the different aisles with produce, meats, dairy, all those kinds of foods. And so I was like, oh, but like an Asian supermarket doesn't have the same categories as like a normal supermarket. So I actually went to Lucky for the first time to do that assignment, instead of going to the one that's literally like not even 10 minutes from my house. So that was an interesting experience that I only think about now when I'm saying it. But otherwise, when I grew up with Vietnamese, my parents are super proud. You can probably hear the Vietnamese music in the back. Because they're watching a whole bunch of Viet shows that are popular in Vietnam right now. I still speak Vietnamese. I do notice I am losing my language, but I've always been really proud that I can speak Vietnamese at the level that I can. I think that's the part because my parents are always reinforcing that, are always saying like, oh, you know, if you didn't speak Vietnamese, then think about how difficult it would be for you to communicate with us, how difficult it would be for you to communicate anywhere where you need to be Vietnamese. Imagine what it would be like when we went to Vietnam and you would be able to speak to your family. Literally, I was speaking with my family yesterday because my uncle is back in Vietnam, and I was looking for resources that are culturally specific to Vietnam, and those resources may only be found there. So I was able to communicate that only because my parents really, really valued Vietnamese language and made sure that I knew it, and that was passed on to me. That in part, and also because Vietnamese is the only language they speak fluently. My dad spoke French before, but there was no way that he was going to speak French to me, especially because my mom doesn't speak French. And so within my household, very Vietnamese, from the food that we eat to the music that we listen to. Within my neighborhood, immediate neighborhood growing up, also very Vietnamese. There are areas a little bit farther away from me that are more Mexican in particular. There are specific supermarkets that have more ethnically relevant foods to Mexican culture, but that is far enough from where I live to where it is not where I would go first for groceries. My mom does work in that area though, so she has been on several instances. Other than that, very strongly Vietnamese, and then like subtly internalizing that it's different from like the American experience.
Oh, I guess there was like a lot of like discrimination because like and racial kind of stigmas towards like, you know, being Asian and being Australian at the same time, because people think like Australians are like white, so like having that around, but it wasn't really that prominent in Australia and within the community that I was in. So yeah, growing up was pretty normal.
There are a lot of small things growing up that were different from any other culture. I found like bringing in different foods that don't appeal to the current masses that everyone loves now. I didn't grow up getting PB&J for lunch. You know, it was very a self-independent thing. Not that I not have the support of my family. It's just that there were definitely cultural differences from everyone around that shown, and that had to be constantly displayed.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of like stereotypes of like Asians, like tiger moms or like Asian tiger moms. I'm not sure. I think that's very similar to in America as well, actually. But basically, the parents really want their children to succeed and do well, so they'll send them to like tutoring and tutoring.
So what was it like for you?
It was so when I was a kid, I actually think my parents aren't like the most Asian of Asian parents.
Okay.
So like they're not that strict and like super like send me like very aggressive with my schoolwork and stuff. But I still went to tutoring when I was like a kid, like when I was in like year 4 and stuff.
Yeah.
For like very specific tests and stuff. And then when we go to those tutoring centers, it would just be all Asians as well, because it's just that's the culture. And then I also live in a really Asian area, so that's also why. Yeah.
It was actually kind of tough here and there because I feel like the city that my parents resided in, which is Guelph, it's really white. There's a lot of Caucasians there. So growing up in school, there weren't that many Asians, and if there were any Asians, like I would gravitate towards them, but the majority of my friends were all Caucasian. And then high school was similar too. But I started becoming more acquainted with a lot of Asian friends as they were in a lot of my classes, but I still hung out with predominantly Caucasian friends. When I was in university, that kind of changed. I kind of gravitated towards a lot of Asians. My university was really known for being full of Asians, so that's where it kind of changed. But growing up, I do feel like I was kind of like a token Asian, and a lot of my friends would not be kind of culturally sensitive to what I was doing with regards to like bringing lunch or certain habits that I do practice, like New Year's, the Lunar New Year. So it was definitely a culture shock for some of my friends, as well as trying to fit in with that stereotype of or societal norms of being kind of Caucasian. So I would consider myself kind of whitewashed when I was interacting with my friends.
The schools that I went to, so like my primary school and my high school, they're also very Asian dominated. So I think like I didn't really see like everyone was very similar in terms of culture and like background to me. So I don't think I really was aware of like a difference in culture, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah. So I guess the difference, like, yeah. So what I thought was like being grown up as like an Asian Australian or Asian American compared to like if I was like a white Australian or a white American, I think it's still quite different.
Yeah.
Because like personally, for what I can speak about is like, you know, we've both been raised in like very Asian communities, so we've had like a support network of like, you know, people who are very similar to us.
Yeah.
So we didn't actually face a lot of discrimination and all that, and I think that comes with like Australia, the country in general as well, because it's quite multicultural, and I think that kind of compares to America in a sense as well. So I think all in all, growing up as an Asian Australian was like a pretty positive experience, not much negative like discrimination that we faced.
Yeah.
So it's fine.
Yeah, I think it was alright.
But there were like certain challenges that we had to adapt to. Like, for example, like we would have to speak like Mandarin or Chinese at home with our families, but then you have to speak English with like your teachers at school or something. And you have to, you know, most of us are all like bilingual, so we speak Chinese and we speak like English as well. Like another big challenge would be like just like general cultural kind of like things. So like for example, like we might like go out and do like really Asian things with my family, so like go to the temple and stuff. But that might not be a thing that like my white Australian friends understand or really get. So I think taking time to explain things to other people around you is like a really big part of growing up as well. So yeah.
Do you feel like there was a lot of like racial like stereotypes that were pushed onto you guys like growing up?
Yeah, I think they definitely were. I don't think any of them were with any malice or like any like negative intent. It was so I guess I'm speaking from like my childhood, because that's kind of it, like during my high school days. Those are probably when I'm like surrounded by more Asians and stuff. So I don't think there was as much discrimination in that sense, because you can't really discriminate against yourself. But like back in the day, like when you're younger, I guess maybe a little bit, but nothing like with any malice, anything like that.
Yeah, I think pretty similar to what he said. I think in general it's just like there are racial stereotypes that people have, but from what I've seen, people don't really express those stereotypes or press them onto you. They just understand that like, you know, some Asians do certain things and act in a certain way, but we don't like discriminate against that. Yeah.
I think a lot of times as well, like we just joke about it amongst ourselves as well.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean by like, it's not really with any malice. It's usually just kind of like lighthearted. It's just kind of like, I don't know, a way of like sharing experiences. Yeah.
So what does the term self-identity mean to you?
Well, self-identity, I think, is how you perceive yourself, you know, and your surroundings, and how you relate to your surroundings and other people. I guess the like broad way saying is like, who am I, you know? And I think it seems like on the surface level like a very like obvious question, you know, but I think when you really think about like where do your values come from, you know, like, or your personality, your characteristics, like why you choose the friends that you choose, or like what you're studying, you know, or like where you want to be in your life. I think these are all aspects to your life that end up creating your identity. So I think like, yeah, there's like, maybe there's like a component that's stable, you know, but I think it's like largely dynamic and changing.
A couple of things. The first thing that comes to mind is that it's a working definition. I think that as I grow, as I experience more harsh realities, experience more people who give me hope, and I experience how different folks identify with themselves, and then how they do that and how they express that. That self-identity is always fluid, in my opinion. Second, I think it's also a place that I can reclaim my identity. I think a lot of times, especially when it comes to racial identity or ethnic identity, that those are defined for me whenever it is I'm filling out paperwork. I'll often see just the lump of Asian or Asian Pacific Islander, and that's where I get the opportunity to mark that, but also question what kinds of identities are not being represented when you lump this together. So sometimes I question, should I mark other and then indicate that I'm Vietnamese, even though some folks might already know that Vietnamese falls under the Asian category, just as a means of declaring that, like, this is my own self-identity. You don't get to put me into a category just because it is convenient for you, and maybe that will provide helpful information. But self-identity is something that I think is highly political. If you are using the category, or if you are conforming to the categories that have been given to you, when there's an opportunity to fight against it, especially when it's something that you disagree, or if the identities that are given for you are the ones that you don't identify with. I think a lot about data and misrepresentation. Self-identity for me is a form of empowering myself and then my communities in the ways that we identify each other and ourselves as community members, but also a place where we have to be very careful about who it is that will misuse our identities for whatever reason that it is, but they do that.
So self-identity to me, it means what you identify yourself to be as. So for example, I self-identify as someone who is Vietnamese, as Canadian, and that's kind of what my identity is, because I was grown up in a Vietnamese household, but on top of that, I was born in Canada, so I do feel patriotic to the country I was born in. In terms of other aspects, there are other things that create your self-identity, such as your gender, your interests, as well as a bunch of factors that kind of mold you into that person you are. So there's so many things that make up your self-identity.
For me, it would just be like who I am as a person based on both my my heritage, my culture, and my experiences, as well as just like the people that I hang around. I suppose that's kind of like I guess also just like the things that you're interested in, like hobbies and whatnot, things like that. I guess.
Yeah, I think similarly, self-identity for me, I think as like an Asian American or an Asian Australian, it's sometimes really hard. There's friction between two cultures, so it's really hard for you to find a self-identity. And for some children, when they're growing up, it's like really hard for them to actually understand whether they're Asian or like they're American or Australian. So like I think for me personally, I've kind of accepted the fact that it's like just a split between the two, and it's just like another form of like kind of identity for me. So like self-identity for me, I just view myself as like an Asian Australian, and that's just how it is. Yeah.
What about privilege? What does that mean to you?
Well, first and foremost, I think if anyone lives in a first world country, they're just like inherently privileged. I know this is a topic about Asian Americans, and this is something I actually think about a lot. I think it's like sometimes I didn't really understand my parents because I brought a lot of like this privilege of living in a society where we don't have to worry about food, or shelter or any kind of like dangers that I know, for example, my parents face or people in their generation, for like example, famine, government corruption, police brutality, I think like some people, even my mom's side, were like political prisoners, I think there's like many levels of privilege, I think this is like where the Wellesley College comes out. I think there's white privilege, I think there's male privilege, and then there's also socioeconomic privilege that goes beyond just gender or racial things.
Privilege is inherited through societal norms or through your group of friends. So for example, there are privileges in society that are predominantly Caucasian with regards to like race. So there's things like white privilege, but also there's privileges in terms of institutions. So there's privileges that you'd get from getting an education, because there's certain things in our systems that put others at oppression if they don't have an education. So I believe there's a direct correlation between the two, in terms of there's a lot of things that contribute to your self-identity, whereas privilege, a lot of the privileges that you have as a certain like race or demographic or what you identify as, that you inherit. So, for example, if you're Caucasian, you identify as Caucasian, you have a lot of privilege in terms of what you can do in society, whereas if you're a minority, there might be a lack of privilege in there. So I believe there is a direct correlation between the two, but they are not the same.
Privilege is something that folks are born with or already have. No one asks to be privileged, but no one asks to be oppressed. I think folks are simultaneously privileged and oppressed. So this is the kind of luxury that folks are provided based off of, or because it is something that advantages them or gives them advantage in the society that we live in today. It can be very arbitrary, and oftentimes it is arbitrary. But because we live in a very Eurocentric, very capitalist society, that the privileges that folks are afforded are the things that grant them those advantages, primarily with regards to wealth and racial categorizing. Folks, it is a place where a lot of folks can feel guilty for having those privileges or possessing those privileges. It is also frequently something that folks don't have to think about simply because they possess that. So I think I will word this in regard, or as a contrast to oppression. Folks who are oppressed are folks who often have to think about what it is that is keeping them or limiting them or serving as a barrier for them from reaching whatever outcomes, goals, achievements, successes that they would like to reach. As society defines, folks with privilege are folks who do not have to think about that. For example, I identify as heterosexual, and our society being heterosexual is something that is the norm. And so in a way, it's a privilege for me to be able to identify myself as that because I am not discriminated against in this society because of my sexual identity. Whereas for others, it's a source of oppression. Privilege doesn't necessarily is also a place where folks have to check themselves because the kinds of privileges that you have are often things that you don't think about, even though the others have to think about this all the time as one of the things that are limiting them, and it's a place where we need to build community, especially when wishing ourselves and in considering how to be allies with each other.
I think self-identity is the foundational backbone which drives whatever you want to do in life, your responsibilities, and without such, then you can't do whatever you want to do. Otherwise, you don't have a vision or goal. And in terms of privilege, if you have the privilege to get your core self-identity early, then you have an easier way of living life. If brushed off the parents or whatever.
Right. I think privilege to me means just having certain things given to you which you wouldn't have personally had if you went out and did it yourself. I don't know.
I think privilege is a lot of opportunity. So I think having them migrate to Australia meant that we had the privilege of getting a good education, being able to have I guess this is in hindsight, but even just fresh air, just a nice country to live in. So I think it's just a lot to do with opportunity, I suppose. I think the opportunity of working, education stuff, going to a good uni, things like that, being able to travel the world, stuff like that, I guess.
Do you believe having the ability to self-identify is a privilege?
Ooh, I do. I do think so, because I think that for the folks who do identify, that they are able to self-identify, then in some ways, or truly self-identify, genuinely and honestly self-identify, I think that can be a privilege because of the dangers that these folks may be protected from. So, for example, again, using sexuality, if I was not heterosexual, if I was any form and any spectrum on the LGBTQIA plus non-binary, then my my ability to self-identify might be at risk or might put me at risk because I don't know what kind of bullying and what kind of harm I will receive as a result of that self-identification.
Okay.
So to be protected from that and shielded from that because of how I identify and how I'm able to safely identify, that's what convinces me that self-identification is a privilege.
Like self-actualization, and I think we all strive towards that, but that is like the top of like the pyramid of needs, and I think that in many situations, like it's not like the most important thing is not your identity, and that's not to say that like our problems are like less than theirs or like to compare and contrast it necessarily, but like when your other needs aren't being met, there's just no way that you can like successfully integrate your identity, and I think that there's also like other aspects to it, like there's cultural aspects to it, because I know like in the West, there's like a heavy emphasis on individualism, and I know like even in like psych studies, they found that how people perceive themselves is really different from the East and the West, whereas like people in Western culture tend to focus on like objects in the foreground, whereas like Eastern subjects tend to like focus on the entire picture or even objects in the background or like the context of the picture. So I think that's like a really interesting, observation to make.
My parents have always been very they've always given me a lot of freedom to do whatever I kind of want to do. They've always just made sure that I'm like studying hard and stuff, and I'm like working hard and whatnot, like all this like work ethic and everything. But in terms of like me deciding what degree I want to do or what profession, they've never pushed me to be like a doctor or a lawyer or anything like that, or like a lot of those Asian stereotypes. So that's just me personally. I do know those pressures do exist for other like some of my friends and things like that.
I feel like what your parents kind of their values would kind of brush off on the children, and that's what's occurred in my family. And I think my parents have always supported me in what I wanted to do. So like they provided me with the privilege to choose who I want to be, and who I want to be is probably like an Asian American from like a kind of Asian Australian from a cultural kind of perspective. And what that means to me is like, I guess just a clash of both cultures, and it's something that I'm still trying to figure out as well. So, and I think you probably will never ever like figure it out like 100%. It's like more of like a journey towards like what kind of culture you are. So yeah.
It's definitely true that we have the privilege to be whatever, like we have the opportunity to kind of go any career path, like because of the education, whereas for them as migrants, they could only work as like maybe a taxi driver or open up a restaurant or whatever. They couldn't really do what they wanted to do. I feel like we definitely get that privilege. Then another side of that is that Asian Australian or Asian American stereotype of like having to be a really good professional or whatever. I think that there's like two sides to that.
What kind of privileges do you think you have due to the efforts of your parents or you immigrating to the U.S.?
Well, I think I'm privileged in the sense that I did get to, even though I struggled with identity for a while, I think the struggle is part of, the developing. So I feel privileged in that sense where I was, even though there were certainly difficult moments and like definitely cultural conflicts, I think at the end of the day, I was still allowed to like decide who I wanted to become, and I think, my parents provided me like, financial support, and that is something I always took for granted, but now, when you're starting to become independent, you realize like that is a huge thing, often a limiting factor in many activities. So I think that's the immediate thing I think of. And then something that I realized later in life is that I began to appreciate, the morals and like the values that my family tried to carry down to me. They didn't really necessarily make sense to me, I think, when I was younger, or like, I didn't understand what cultural differences really meant growing up. I kind of just like threw that word around. But then like when I started studying more in college about like my own culture and just like thinking about how I relate to people in the world, I realized, like I did integrate like all these values that my parents taught me, and you know, to like learn more about it. It makes me feel like I'll always have like home with me, you know, like to have like these values that I can go to and like identify. And then when I meet other people with similar values, like it feels like a bigger sense of community, which I really value.
Very nice.
I think that in my ability to self-identify as a proud Vietnamese American, that has taken a lot of unlearning that my immigrant and refugee parent background is something that I can be proud of, because it has given me the chance to really truly given me the chance to better understand what it means to be Southeast Asian, what it means to be Vietnamese, which is something that I wouldn't say I wouldn't say that's a privilege. I think that in the context of our society today, that's something that that is framed to be bad or weird or different. Like white people don't have to think that like, oh, I am proud to be white. But I think for me, like I've been given like a cultural privilege to be able to truly understand what it means to have this experience and to bring that in, because I'm definitely not the only one, and because there's so many folks living in our country today who have that background, that this gives me the opportunity to better understand and work and serve these folks specifically. I think a lot more about the oppressions that have existed against me because of my family's background in being immigrant and refugee, but also low income. So I think there's a lot of cultural privilege that I have been given, but that doesn't necessarily align with the privileges that will help me go far in the society that I'm in today.
I have the privilege of opportunity, mostly. I have the privilege of having an education, privilege of eating whenever I want to, going to college, all those different things. Because they were able to come here and set up shop and force their way into the market to be successful.
So the privileges I think that I do have was the privilege of having education. So my parents, because they immigrated from Vietnam, they didn't really have the privilege of having that education, because they kind of started anew and tried to work and get immediate money in order to support a family. So in order to provide the resources for myself to succeed, I was able to attain an education. So I got educational privilege there, and that has allowed me to take up other opportunities that have contributed to my self-identity. So I was involved with VSA because I had the privilege of education, and because that VSA was a part of that university. So I gained more self-identity in terms of me being a Vietnamese Canadian, and that has got me more involved with my VSA regionally. I don't think I would have gotten involved with VSA if I didn't have that educational privilege. So I'm really thankful for my parents for allowing me to have that kind of privilege. And because I've had education with regards to having a master's, I was able to take up job opportunities that required some educational background. So those are the privileges that I do have. I also feel like because of my race, and also because of certain policies that favor person of color, I do have some privileges that other people do not have, such as there are some scholarships that I did apply to because I identified as a Vietnamese Canadian, whereas person that's Caucasian descent, they didn't have that privilege to apply to that scholarship.
There's two main points to what I'm going to say. The first one is the sacrifices that they made locally and internationally. So locally, when they were in China, they had very professional jobs. Like my mom was an accountant, my dad was a university teacher, and they left that for me to migrate to Australia. And when my dad and mom first came to Australia, they were working doing car washes, the dishwashing, cleaning and stuff, in restaurants. And they did that for several years before they even started kicking off what they've been doing till now. So like for them, they've been working hard to provide me with opportunities, send me to school, provide me with good education. But I think on the flip side also is that Australia in general has a very good system for like kind of helping students like through education mainly. So like we give out like loans and stuff, which kind of is different from America. And I think the government also supported my parents in a way sometimes when they were in need. And so that was a really big plus. But in terms of like actual personal like values and stuff, yeah, I think my dad and my mom would have to like adapt to the Australian culture, which is much different from what they're used to. There's like things that people who you interact with, the main thing would be like the language barrier as well, because they have to speak English. So yeah.
Very similar to what Martha said, language barrier is probably the biggest one, like adapting to new cultures and stuff. So like I know my mom, she's an accountant, but she had to study while she had me and my sister. She had to study through that to get her degree and everything, so that she could get a job in Australia. So that was like a big sacrifice. Obviously for them, they also had to sacrifice being with their family back at home, especially now when their parents are like my grandparents are a lot older, and like with my mom now, she really wants to like be there for them. So that's kind of tough as well, because obviously it's not so easy to just organize and leave work in Australia to go back to China and take care of your parents and whatnot. So there's definitely a bit of that. Another thing is like Marsh said, the language barrier. So for my mom, she's an accountant. She's told me that like it's very hard for her to move up in business just because of that language barrier. Like she can do all the work very well, but because she's got like she's not fluent in English, it's very hard for her. And that's also something that along the that she's also had like they've also had to deal with along the way, is just not being able to like speak English and whatnot. And sometimes just like struggling with that.
Personally, do you feel obligated to be the person that your parents sought you out to be? Or do you feel as if there exists a part of you that wants to be your own person? If so, who is that person and how have you achieved it?
I try to be really like fair about answering this question, you know, because I don't think my parents were perfect, you know, and they're very different on their own too. But overall, I would say like on paper, they said I could pick whatever I wanted to be. They just wanted me to be happy, and they like labeled out like certain points, like you know, you have to support yourself, you have to be independent, you know, you have to do something that makes you feel good about yourself. You know, all these things that I really value and like believe in. And that's something that I think really shaped my character, like my work drive, you know, my ethics and like my ambition. And I really appreciate that. But then sometimes I feel like, you know, in a way, it's better now, but in a way I felt like they viewed me as like an object almost when I was growing up, or like their property to an extent. Not like they literally own me, but like to them that's how they show their love, you know? So I felt like growing up is really difficult because I was always being told like I was wrong, or like I should do this, or like if I do this like bad things will happen, or like blah blah blah, like all these warnings. And that's something that I realized like maybe this is like from the psych aspect of it that I think a lot about, but I realized that shapes like a lot of your confidence, you know, and your sense of identity, and also like, you know, like your relationship with other people. And like that's something that I wish like could have been improved on. And like I see this in a lot of other like Eastern Asian people alike, is that like sometimes it's like, for example, like difficult to like assert like what you want, you know, be assertive or like draw boundaries with people, because like I don't know, in a way like growing up I kind of felt like I didn't have a voice in that sense. Yeah.
Very nice. That concludes the official questions. I'm trying to think of a follow-up question for you. Okay. So do you think that when you were growing up, like all these, you know, when you're growing up inside this community, what you mentioned, like, you know, third grade, middle school, high school, as well as like the variables that your family also puts in to you and yourself, do you think that that has changed you and your own self-identity, your own self-image in a positive or negative way? Or do you think that like there really is no like positive and negative, and you just kind of like put it all together and made this result that is like you yourself?
I definitely think it's more close towards the last option you said. I definitely think, there's positive and negative aspects to it. Like, for example, growing up, it was much easier to feel like an alien, to feel like I didn't belong. I was actually very close with my grandparents, so I was fluent in Chinese. So I was able to like communicate really well with like both sides of the culture. And I also, I went to China a lot and interacted with people. And that's something that always like bugged me growing up, is like in America, like I'd be made fun of for being like a nerd or like an Asian, like not even super viciously, but like enough that it made me feel like uncomfortable, and that like I couldn't really like be friends, with like a lot of the kids in my school. And also adding into it, like I grew up in a town where there weren't a lot of other Asian people, or even other minorities. So it wasn't like we had a lot of other options either, and then it also bothered me because then when I went to China, they'd be like, haha, like, 美国人, like, so they wouldn't accept me either, and that was something that at first, like, it made me feel like I didn't belong to any group. And I think that is just like a really sad feeling that people, like anyone could go through, But fortunately, what really helped me personally was like when I went to college, I started taking Chinese as a language. Like I took some Chinese history classes, and I got involved in like cultural orgs. And then I also ended up studying abroad in Beijing for a summer session, and I had like a native roommate, and like stuff like that really helped me connect like with that part of my culture and heritage deeply, in a way that like I stopped viewing it as like no one understands me, but more as like, oh, I understand them now, and that helped me like bridge so many gaps, I feel like, with the Eastern Asia, like the Chinese aspect of me. And that, I think that is the part that needed to heal the most, because like there are obviously a lot of things with being a Westerner that I like and I value, but as a minority, I wanted to like bolster like that aspect to my identity. So like being able to have that made me much more a confident person. And now like on a good, like if not reflecting on my childhood woes, I'm like, in the end, if like you can resolve these things, it does become like an asset, because like that's the whole point of like multiculturalism, is you want to learn things that are just not salient or observable in like one culture,
Okay, great. Thank you so much for your answers. I really appreciate you coming in. But that's it. That's all the questions I have.
Bye.
Very nice.
Okay. Personally, do you feel obligated to be the person that your parents sought you out to be? Or do you feel as if there exists a part of you that wants to be your own person? Who is that person, and how and have you achieved it?
Absolutely. So for me personally, I'm lucky. Lucky isn't the right word. It happens to be the case that I do want to go into a field that they would define as admirable, as a good job, as a stable job, and as a very respectable job. So that's like in healthcare and medicine specifically. So I haven't had the I've never had to consider, or I did consider, but not like go far with that consideration, of what if my parents need me to, or like what if I want to do anything else. My parents went through so much, 9 years in France. Most of her, at this time, my mom was still doing a lot of work. She was the head of the household for a lot of things. And so, like, yes, in that sense, so not career-wise, which is something that I think comes up very often for other folks, but in a lot of ways that I think, or I often frame that a lot of what I do is surrounded by the sacrifices of my family. In my case, when thinking about healthcare and thinking about my capacity to do medicine, then I think about, okay, in our world today, Very few people, or in the United States in particular, very few people get to be doctors or healthcare providers. What if I don't make it? For my parents who did so much for me, that means that like I wasn't able to pay them back for the sacrifices that they've made. But I also have I want, it's a little bit morbid even. I think about this with folks who I meet, but I also think about this like with my parents, that I never know when it is or what it is that they might be going through. I think oftentimes I do know because they are very transparent with me on what it is that they're going through. But I never know like what if there's something that I didn't consider. What if it's their mental health and I didn't know about? What if it's what if they're having a really bad day and me describing my stresses as a Vietnamese American who is doing her best in school but not getting it, like still not making it there. What does that mean for them? Like how hurt will they be if I don't make it? As hurt as I would be for my own inability or like incapacity to make it to where I want to make it, I think it weighs even more for them. So I often do think about like what are the implications of me not making it and reaching the goals I set for myself. And specifically, what happens if I don't reach the goals that my parents set for me? Like even when there was still something like, what if I would do nursing instead? And then for my parents, that translated to, oh, you're picking a career that has much less power than doctors do. And for them who have had so much power stripped away from them, I think that was the underlying meaning behind it, because they wanted me to make sure I had my own agency in doing the work that I do and not have to obey anyone's orders in doing nursing. Even though it is a part of healthcare, which is a very like nice field for them to see me in, simply the role of nursing as opposed to being a doctor is something that they felt threatened by even. I mean, self-identification for a high school student is like, what kind of student will I be that a university won't accept me? So I didn't really think about it until after that, because I did a lot of organizing at Berkeley, and a lot of that organizing is specific for Asian American Pacific Islander, and they consider the hyphen of like Asian American and my Vietnamese and my Vietnamese American. I have friends who only identify as Vietnamese and not American, but I've made the distinction that like racially or ethnic, or let's go back. Ethnically, then I'm full Vietnamese. Culturally, Vietnamese American, because I spent a lot of time in school, and in school, the American culture is the predominant culture. So Vietnamese American, simply because like whether or not I want to, then that's the environment that I have lived in, and that's undeniably shaped some of the ways that I think, some of the ways that I speak back to or talk back to my parents, and then some of the influences that I like so deeply ingrained from when I started school until now. So like there are those distinctions that I can make and have the agency to make. That in part came from my community and how they find power and resiliency in reclaiming the Vietnamese identity and the Asian identity. I think Vietnamese in particular, because when we like break down the numbers, when we do data disaggregation, and there are much fewer folks who identify as Vietnamese than there were in the VSA space, the NASA space, and it's like, wow, there's so many people. But then once we leave those bubbles, then where are we? Are we represented literally anywhere else? So I think a lot of that comes from parents and what they've instilled in me, their values in me, from community, because that's where they seek power and reclaiming. And then for me personally, because I'm the product of all of these experiences. I also find it empowering that I get to say that I am Southeast Asian American, I'm Vietnamese American, in a way that like no one else, and like taking ownership of something that someone else might usually just pass off as. Like anywhere I go, I can either pass as American, too American to be Vietnamese, or to be Vietnamese American, and too Vietnamese to be an American. So like I get to make that final call, and that's something that I'm really lucky that I get to make the final call in.
They never really wanted me to be any certain profession or anything like that, so that's like, I know that's something that a lot of Asian households face. But I guess they just had like a general person that wanted to be like, you know, like successful, enjoying life and whatnot, but nothing like super like pressured. And I think it's what they want me to be is also what I want myself to be. So I don't really feel that it was them pushing me. It was more just like something that I also wanted to do myself, in just like a very general sense. Like they just want to be like enjoy what I do and be like successful, I guess.
Yeah.
And that's also what I want to be.
I think in terms of personal obligation, I think the answer would be like yes and no. So like I do feel obligated to kind of like, you know, help my mother out, not make my family kind of worry about what I want to do in the future. So I do take it upon myself a responsibility to kind of, you know, have those values that they have and embody them. But I also feel like I do want to paint my own path, and it's a path that, you know, is highly supported by my family, and you know, we share the same view and perspective on what I want to achieve and what we want to achieve as a family.
I believe growing up, there's always been this Confucius thing where you have to follow certain rituals growing up, meaning whatever that was instilled in you morally, you'd have to follow. And those ideas do carry on in life. You want to be successful and all these different things, but individually, in order to be happy, I find that like if you don't find your own vision, then you're not going to be happy. And those are two clashing ideas that always changes. Because you want to be successful, but you don't know how to be successful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in terms of model minority, like the bamboo ceiling, there are a bunch of things that deter Asians from having an equal outcome, which I don't believe that should be the case, but it does affect the end goal, such as having equal opportunity is always great, but sometimes opportunities aren't always given. Like I find that universities, for example, have Asians compete against each other in terms of the grades they put out, even though there are other students that don't have as good grades, as proven statistically from other schools. And although that may be great, it does stifle what we can do in the future, if possible. Also, being the model minority means that we as Asians are put at a higher standard, and those Asians that aren't at that standard don't get the help they need. So me being Chinese, of course, it's easier for me to say that having this East Asian culture has brought me more privileges in my life, but I know there are Southeast Asian families out there or their culture that don't always cross at the same point, meaning if they need help, they won't get the help they need because no matter what, they're going to be seen as model minorities. If they don't follow these certain stereotypes, then they won't be accepted into the culture of things. Although things are changing now, thank God.
I do feel like I'm indebted to my parents, so they've worked so hard to raise me, and I do feel that some of their decisions I have partly influenced what I want to do in life, but they provide me with a really supportive environment so that I can pursue anything that I would want to do. So I feel like my interests kind of aligned with their interests too, because they have shaped me into the person who I am today. Growing up, while I did love the arts and that was something that I would want to pursue, had it not been for the unstable environment or the lack of certainty within that field, I would have pursued that if there was more certainty. But in terms of pursuing something in healthcare, I feel like there's more certainty with that, and that was kind of aligned with what my parents were interested in. So that was kind of getting the best of both worlds. In terms of being my own person, my parents do acknowledge that we're not the same individuals, even though growing up they did prescribe their values to me, and I do feel like I adopted some of those values. Because they taught me things to respect society for, as well as other things that you should carry yourself as when you're presenting yourself to the public. So that has helped me be the person who I am, and achieving that image of being that polite person to society. I do feel like my personality has kind of been shaped by my parents. Growing up, we were taught to be obedient to authority figures, so that has kind of translated to the authority figures in my workplace or in educational institutions. So I do feel like that has my personality has developed into someone who's more reserved and not as assertive as other people. And that is something that I'm working at so that I can have like a voice. I've learned that obedience doesn't really get you far, and you have to be assertive where appropriate, but definitely respecting older figures as well as higher ups is something that my parents have taught me, but also like standing up for yourself. They didn't really teach me that. They taught me to kind of like listen to older figures, and that has been the area where I differentiated from what my parents kind of sought me out to be, because you need to stand up for yourself and the causes and that you are passionate about, and if you don't stand up, you can't really make a change. So that's where I feel like there's that generational gap where my parents are focusing on kind of listening to your elders and listening to everything they say, whereas the younger generation of myself, we are more so about making a change and trying to stray away from that norm. And that's hopefully like through that, like that's where I have achieved my image. But all in all, I feel like my parents did shape me into the person I am today. There are some differences in what I want to present myself as than my parents. And yeah, I think that's everything. Good luck, Larry. Miss you, fam. But
Yeah, I'd go with that. Good.
That's pretty much it.
Excellent. Sounds good. Alright, theatre.
I am. Did you say age? Or
Name major. So we can start over.
Okay.
Marsh is like, do you have a sister?
It's like you
I was
ask
gonna
like
be like,
every
is she,
time
I was gonna be like, is she hot? But like, that's inappropriate.
That is good.
No, every morning. You know, every,
He's like, no.
Alright, let's go.
Oh man, this is a...
Speak louder.
Speak louder. Yeah, speak louder. Get those Australian accents louder.
Okay.
Good day, mates.
Let's talk.
So how did
Stop. Halt.
like back then rice was a commodity?
No, it was.
It was, yeah.
It's because they had to ship rice from South America.
They just did not. Did they?
What?
Is that true?
No, it is true.
It's true.
That's why right
What
now...
about the rice farmers in like...
No,
No, rice, dude, back when
China
like,
does not produce
like
enough
the
rice.
war,
Yeah.
back when like World War II,
Yeah.
rice was a commodity.
Yeah.
Like,
Oh yeah, that's true. It was like gold.
yeah,
Yeah.
it was like a commodity.
That's true. That's
I
true.
didn't know that.
And the mantles and stuff.
I didn't know that.
Rice was like
No,
more
did she have
expensive
mantles
than,
like currency?
When was rice expensive?
rice was like pretty.
What did she say?
That's why right now...
When was rice expensive?
Did you knew that?
Rice are expensive. Rice are expensive.
I didn't. She asked me. She told me that rice are
Rice are
expensive, and I was like, huh.
What does the term self-identity mean to you? Just like the term self-identity.
The identity of the self.
Identity of the self.
Okay.
Like how you see yourself.
Self-identity.
You must be. You must be from Australia.
Okay.
Is this even gonna work for your project? Because we're Australians and you want Asian American.
So even though you guys are from a different country, I don't think it matters because like the experiences are the same.
Fair enough. Okay.
So that's why I'm
It's
okay with
inspired
it.
by subtle Asian traits.
No, it's not. It's just
You're up next, mate. Don't be laughing. Wait till you go.
Kelly,
You better start thinking of answers.
what's your name?
What is your name? I'm
Kelly Beans.
I'm Kelly Beans. Add me on Snapchat.
What about the term privilege?
Right. I think
Come on, guys. 3 more questions. 3 more questions.
I would make you. I don't think you answered this question.
Also, I went. Also,
Ready? What was it like growing up as an Asian Australian?
That's a very good question. I mean,
can't really compare it.
can't really compare it to anything else. Just growing up as an Asian Australian was like normal.
I think growing up as an Asian Australian, you're pushed a lot from a young age to study hard and work hard and shit. Why not sweat?
I
Don't swear.
It's alright. I think. Wait, are you gonna cut this or?
Yes, please do.
yeah.
Like, or is it, and you just take one.
Wait, do we have to answer like one on one? Or just say I can both answer?
Yeah, you can both answer. Yeah, he could. Yeah, just, I want you two
Like a
to do it
conversation.
together so that you can have conversation.
Oh,
yeah,
wow.
yeah, because you guys are friends. You know,
Yeah.
like yeah.
We're not friends.
Oh, okay.
Hate it. Absolutely.
Let's clear that up.